Welcome to this episode of Industry Insights. I'm Dr. Darin Detwiler, and today we're with Dr. David McSwane. Dr. McSwane is the Executive Director of the Conference for Food Protection since 2012. He's a retired professor in the Department of Public Health at Indiana University, Purdue University School of Medicine in Indianapolis, and was a founding board member of the conference back in the early 1980s. Dr. McSwane, thank you for being here with us today.
My pleasure, Darin.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Conference for Food Protection, or CFP?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I think there's probably maybe three things that I'd want to raise relative to sort of the background of CFP. One is a little bit about our history. The second would be our mission. And then the third would be specifically some of the objectives that CFP has established for itself over the years. As you mentioned, actually, the first gathering of the Conference for Food Protection was in 1971. So we're actually celebrating our 50th anniversary. This meeting was sponsored by the Food and Drug Administration and the American Public Health Association. It met in Denver, Colorado. And really the focus at that particular point in time was primarily on microbiological aspects of foodborne illness, because if you obviously, you think back through history, you know that in the 70s, we really were dealing with salmonella and a lot of, things that were pathogens of biological origin. And so that was the first time. I was not at that meeting. I actually was involved in the second meeting, which met in 1984 in Washington, D.C. Why there was a 12-year gap between the first meeting and the second meeting, no one really has ever explained, other than I think it was simply a matter that, maybe the stars didn't get aligned properly. But in 1984, at that second meeting, it was decided that not only were microbiological pathogens of significance related to foodborne illness, but also there were toxicological issues now that were apparent. And so the scope of CFP was broadened then, and at that meeting, to include both microbiological and toxicological pathogens related to foodborne illness. The conference met for the third time in 1986 in Ann Arbor. And at that particular meeting, it really was sort of the meeting that formalized the existence of CFP as an organization. There was a constitution and bylaws passed that gave the organization structure. It established specific mission and objectives. And at that particular point, it was decided that probably as much due to the availability of resources to the conference, but also of sort of the pressing issues in food safety at the time, that the focus of CFP then would be narrowed to deal with retail food safety matters. Also at that meeting, it was decided that because of the rapidly changing landscape of both retail food in the industry itself, as well as the situation we were dealing with foodborne illness and pathogens, that it was appropriate for the group to meet at least every 2 years from that point. And we have in fact done that. From 1986 until we just completed our most recent meeting this last August. It was a meeting that was supposed to have been held in 2020 rather, but due to COVID-19, we had to postpone it to August of 2021. So again, we are an organization that has a lot of experience when it comes to dealing with these kinds of issues. So I think hopefully that historical background will give you a little bit of sense that we certainly are not by any means the new kid on the block. As far as the missions of the conference, probably the two that I think maybe are of most interest to your audience would be that we really do focus on issues or problems that are emerging related to retail food safety. And it is the goal of CFP to use a consensus building process to not only identify problems, but to come up with recommendations for solutions to those problems that will satisfy both the regulatory and the retail food industry communities, as well as consumers, and certainly academics are an important component of the organization. The other mission, I think, is to maintain balance so that throughout our history and throughout really all of the dealings within CFP, we do stress the importance of having balance between the perspective of the regulators and the industry, as well as representing the interests of consumers and bringing in the expertise of academicians. So we think that that is probably one of the things that has contributed to the success of CFP, and certainly has led FDA to view CFP as probably the single most important organization when it comes to revisions and new substance in the food code itself. As far as our objectives, as I mentioned, we do seek solutions using a consensus building approach, which again, this is assured not only by means of our different constituencies, but also there are geographical balances that we try to maintain as well, because as you know, things are done a little differently on the West Coast than they are the East Coast, as well as the North and the South, and certainly the middle part of the US. We do promote science as the basis for food safety regulation. So we are certainly wanting to make sure that any recommendations coming out of the conference are based on sound science. And if in those situations where we think an issue has merit, but it necessarily haven't gotten to the bottom of it based on the scientific approach, then we will probably recommend that either one of our federal agency partners or an entity in the private sector or a university would be approached to do the kind of research needed to answer the questions that we have in a scientifically valid manner. We do propose solutions, and we hope those solutions will be palatable to both the regulatory members of the organization as well as the industry members. We certainly know that, as in life in general, you can't always please everyone, but we do think that by making people feel like they are part of the decision-making process, that the outcomes of that process are going to be more acceptable to them. And then last, I think, but not least, one of the objectives we have is to disseminate information about food safety to not only our own membership, but also to the public at large. And I think an example of where we are working most recently is FDA has created a Retail Food Safety Regulatory Association collaborative, which CFP is one of the founding members. And it is certainly one of the objectives of this group is to also help to disseminate information both to our constituencies as well as the general public. So we think that is probably something that is of great value. Lastly, our membership, we really have sort of four key membership constituent groups. We have regulators from the federal, state, and local levels. We also have members who are from territorial and tribal agencies. Our industry members represent food service, retail food establishments, and food stores, vending and distribution, as well as companies and various segments of the industry that provide support services to food service and retail food stores, et cetera. As I mentioned, academics are certainly an important part of our constituencies. And typically the academics that are involved with CFP are ones who probably are teaching either in schools of public health and are dealing with preparing professionals in environmental health or public health, as well as those in food science departments, as well as those in extension programs. And certainly we have some who are actively involved in doing research in food law and things of that nature. And then we have consumers. Obviously, we don't actually reach out to the general public as a consumer, but when we think of consumers, we're really thinking of employees or agencies of consumer organizations that have a mission that is related to food safety and to retail food safety in particular.
Yeah, I have to admit, I've been fortunate, I've been honored and had the privilege to serve 2 terms in the past as a committee member, a council member, excuse me, and I'll be working more closely with CFP in the future. And these meetings, it's an incredible opportunity to see this cross section from state, federal, FDA, USDA, CDC, industry organizations, NGOs. There's such a rich representation different geographic representation. Um, Such a rich diversity of the voices that come together and talk about these issues and provide perspectives that allow those making decisions to in terms of what issues go forward or not, to really take into consideration the multiple perspectives on those issues, um, even to the point where giving the opportunity for those in attendance to provide that kind of point counterpoint conversation, or what about this element? Well, this works for this place, but we can't have it so strict that it doesn't apply to this location or to this application. It really opens up the eyes of the council members.
And I think you raised several very good points. First and foremost, an issue, and again, I think a lot of our members and probably the people who are just familiar with CFP in general view our biennial meetings more as a Congress rather than an educational kind of meeting, because we really don't sit and have sort of educational programs, whether they're plenary or concurrent sessions or whatever. We are really a working meeting where individuals who are, as you mentioned, appointed as voting members of councils and their alternates are vetting issues, and anyone can submit an issue. It doesn't have to be just a CFP member or a CFP committee. Anybody can submit an issue. And the only really criteria we have for accepting an issue, well, I guess there's two. One is it has to sort of be within the mission of CFP. So it's got to be something that in general deals with a retail food safety matter. And secondly, it has the recommendation that is part of that issue has to be plausible. In other words, we just can't, someone can't say, well, we think the FDA should provide a $3 trillion kick in budget for state and local retail food programs. While we all maybe like to see that happen, obviously the feasibility of that happening is probably remote at best. So, but anyone can submit an issue. These issues then are reviewed and are assigned to the three councils. And the first council one deals with basically policy and regulations. Council two deals with education, administration, and certification. And council three deals with science and technology. So the issues themselves are distributed to the councils that we think probably have the expertise that is best able to effectively vet those issues. And as you mentioned, during the vetting process, there's a lot of discussion that takes place, and people from the audience are given an opportunity to comment on the issues and provide input. Certainly, the issue submitter is given an opportunity to provide additional information that may have occurred since they submitted the issue and it was accepted for assignment to a council. And we certainly have, again, a broad cross-section of membership on the council, so that we have regulatory at all levels of government. We have industry dealing with all of the various subgroups that we've talked about. We have academics, we have consumers. Our federal agency partners provide consultants who are non-voting members, but certainly are vital to the process because of the expertise that they bring to the council for the subjects that are being discussed. And so, we do stress that that hopefully, again, the process assures that the issue is not only properly vetted, but that anything that comes out of the council, and generally that's going to be one of three options. Either an issue will be accepted as submitted, it can be accepted as amended, or the council can recommend no action, which simply means that in their mind, it's probably something that would not be worthy of further consideration by CFP. But regardless, we hope that the submitter, as well as the people on the council themselves, believe that the issue has been given a fair hearing, and that the decision that was made, and by the way, if the decision is to take no action, the council has to specify why. We just can't say, well, we don't like the submitter or we don't like the issue. It has to be something more specific than that. And in some cases, it may be that they feel that the issue's already been addressed by the food code or some other regulatory measure. It may be that they believe that that an issue maybe is paralleled in another issue, and so they're going to address that topic in that issue as opposed to the original one. Whatever the case might be, there has to be justification. The issues then and those recommendations go to our Assembly of Delegates, which are the representative of our 50 state programs that deal with retail food safety, some in public health, some in agriculture. Florida, for instance, has the Licensing Professions Bureau that does some work. And then we have some territorial, as well as the District of Columbia is represented, and it is that group that actually is sort of the final gatekeepers on the issues, and they cannot change the recommendations of the council, but they can vote up or vote down, or vote to take no action as well. So again, I think that over the years, a very significant priority has been to maintain balance and fairness, and to certainly have a process that results in consensus building for the finished product. And granted, I mean, the food code obviously is a model, and it's not law until the state's adopted, but it certainly provides a foundation upon which most of our retail food activities in the country are based. And you know, as I mentioned in the presentation, I think FDA, if you ask them about, you know, what they view as sort of being the contributors to the food code and its future, they would probably put CFP at the top of the list just because of our process. And you know, again, they were holding up on the 2021 food code until after we met in August, and we've submitted our comments to them, and hopefully they'll have their response to us by Thanksgiving. And I would guess that at least some, if not all, of our recommendations will somehow be incorporated into the next version of the food code that now will come out probably in 2022.
You know, Dr. McSwane, you mentioned FDA food code in terms of you know, states adopting it and their timeline. What do you see are some of the challenges or obstacles in terms of why some states have adopted newer versions, whereas some are close to 20 years old in terms of the version that they're still using?
Well, and I think a lot of it simply has to do with sort of the mindset of the policymakers and the decision makers. You know, we have some states which have really gone sort of, you know, to the extreme for home rule, and they pretty much want to allow anything to go, you know, and this impacts things like the cottage food industry. It affects things that are distributed in farmers markets. And you know, it used to be that we would say, well, you know, if it's a prepackaged product and it's a non-TCS food, you know, that's okay. But you know, now some of these states are just throwing this wide open, and they're just pretty much allowing anything and everything. And I think people, you know, I think obviously they have to understand there's some assumed risk when you purchase those kinds of products, but I'm not sure the vendors necessarily tell them that, nor do I think that, you know, their legislators are telling them that. They're more interested in the economics than they are the food safety side of things. And as I said, there's sort of two factions. There's the one group that says, you know, we make progress, we do get our codes updated, but it takes us someplace, you know, between usually 2 to 4 or 4 to 6 years in order to get the process completed. And we have others that said, we've got a 2009 version of the code, and we're not about to open it up because we're afraid if we do, that we may lose ground instead of gain ground. And we just don't want to give the legislator or legislature of that jurisdiction the opportunity to go in and start making, you know, drastic cuts in the law and what it requires. So I think it really does. It's the people who are in the legislature who and again, you know, the state health departments, the state Department of Agriculture, they certainly are promoting, you know, the food code and adoption of a current version of the food code. The collaborative has created a food code adoption work group that specifically developed a toolkit to help facilitate this as well. But, you know, it all really is in the hands of those decision makers and getting them on board. And and we do try to emphasize the importance of getting industry committed, because if industry says, yeah, well, this is something we need, and in some cases for them it may be, a way to improve their competitive advantage in the industry. We see that as being an okay thing, whatever it takes to get people to, in the end, accept the fact that we need, a food protection program that's based on sound science and practice.
Is there a notable impact on, let's say, the company that is in one location versus a nationwide retailer with establishments across the country that are dealing with multiple versions of the FDA food code
And
based on where they are?
that is a group that really is challenged, because this patchwork regulation that we have makes it really difficult. They would much prefer to have the same standard, obviously, nationwide. And I would certainly think that would be beneficial to them. And not only those working in 50 states, but even those that are on a more local regional basis. If you're dealing in a 3 or 4 state area, it would be advantageous. For the single mom and pops, it's not for them. It's really not theirs is more, do I have the resources to enable me to comply? Upgrading my equipment, training my employees, and it's, again, as we're dealing now with staffing shortages, this is becoming a much more significant challenge as well. So, at this point, we're just trying to, I think in most cases, our regulators are just trying to sort of maintain their position without losing ground, and knowing that some of the industry challenges that they're facing is really significant in determining, their priorities.
Final question. What do you see as potential issues or direction for either CFP and or the FDA food code?
Well, I think obviously the food code, we're not seeing as much in the way of changes now, although, I think this year we had 18 recommendations sent to FDA that dealt with specifically some facet of the food code. Certainly, we're always trying to find new and better ways to control foodborne illness. We're looking for active managerial control opportunities that can be incorporated within the industry. We're looking at providing more sound education of food protection managers, who are the people in charge of most retail food establishments and so forth. I think, the challenges that we face going forward probably fall within sort of a couple of elements. One is there's different technologies. This whole e-commerce thing is something that had not until recently been really on the radar. We also, I think, still have a lot of foodborne illness issues that can be resolved through behavioral change of workers, managers, and others in the retail food industry. And those are problems we just can't ignore, because in some cases they're sort of the foundation upon which change going forward is going to have to take place. And I think maybe last but not least, we certainly are trying our best to get jurisdictions nationally to adopt a more recent version of the food code. And that is a challenge. I mean, if you think about it, a lot of states, if they've adopted the food code, it could be a process that can range from anywhere from 2 to 4 to 6 years from the time the process starts until it gets finished, because it just simply takes that long, to work with the legislative bodies and the decision makers in the state to get the support. Some states tell us that they're really reluctant to even open up that discussion because they may lose ground potentially if legislators and decision makers aren't supportive, of a regulated retail food industry and so forth. So, but we do know that those jurisdictions typically that have adopted a more recent version of the food code and are working on the implementation of the guidelines in those codes typically have more successful retail food programs, which results in a reduction in foodborne illness, among other things. And so, I think we have plenty of justification, but it doesn't do anything to reduce the magnitude of the challenge that we face. We think all of our stakeholders and constituents benefit from the CFP process because, again, the things coming out of the conference, we hope will sort of perpetuate improvements and benefits to retail food safety. From the consumer point of view, we do certainly value, and we are very much interested in all aspects of retail food safety from farm to table. So we are not only interested in the actual practice and principles within the retail food setting, but also what happens to the food flow upstream, and also are we properly assuring that consumers are properly educated to handle food safely once they purchase it, whether that's for preparation at home or whether that's in a ready-to-eat form that they have gotten from their local restaurant or supermarket. So, and we do think that the consumers have an important role to play in food safety, because we can certainly do everything possible and maybe be very successful in assuring food is safe at the point of sale. But if it's abused by the consumer, either on the way home or during the way home or at some other juncture, then we probably have put all that previous effort to no valuable outcome. So we do want the consumers to feel like that they are properly represented. We certainly are dealing with a lot of topics of interest to consumers, like major food allergens is something that's ongoing. As I mentioned, having an educated workforce so that you don't have to worry about, if you're going to the buffet, are the tools that you're getting your food from stored properly in the food? Are things being properly cleaned and sanitized, for your safety and those kinds of things. So we really, and again, our constituents are working together to assure the safest product that we can provide to consumers. And then we also want the consumers to assume the responsibility for keeping it safe after the point of sale.
Dr. David McSwane, Executive Director for the Conference for Food Protection. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, Darin. Have a great day.